Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Game Mess. So we're gonna get some more 3DO FPGA core tests for you today. Just because I really felt like testing out some more games on the work in progress MiSTer FPGA 3DO core. If we're gonna make a video out of it, might run it as a bonus episode at 8 p.m. Just not quite sure yet. But honestly, playing around with this core has been amazing, and I've yet to find a game that I cannot get to boot up. Kicking it off, we're going right into PO'd. Now this game definitely is divisive. I'm not saying it's the best game in the world. I'm not saying it's the worst game in the world. I'm just saying that it was super ambitious and was a fun time on 3DO. I mean, any game that has gigantic butts running around as an enemy, you at least have to give it an extra point on the review score for that hilariousness alone. But it's one of those things, PO'd always gets made fun of for being a bad game, and honestly, I don't think it is a bad game whatsoever. It definitely has kind of that Doom corridor shooter vibe going on, but of course not as good as Doom. But its sense of place, its overall scale, and just weird ridiculousness absolutely make this game better than the sum of its parts. Because the reality of PO'd is it's absolutely a vibe, it is so weird, and that's what really makes this game excel, even if the gameplay is definitely like C+ to B- territory. And honestly, the levels in PO'd are absolutely massive and really show just how much the 3DO could do at once. They have so much verticality, there's so much actually going on in each level. It really does show that in the right hands, the 3DO could do some really fun things. But before we talk any more about giant space butts, go ahead down below, hit like and subscribe, and ring that notification bell. Definitely helps us out. And if you feel so inclined to want to support the channel, I got a Patreon link down below as well. But PO'd is one of those games you have to absolutely give it time. If you like that kind of boomer shooter, that corridor shooter from back in the DOS days, then PO'd definitely has a lot to love here. So much so that just recently Night Dive Studios remastered the entire game, making it probably the de facto best version to play. But the 3DO is the original, and I would say it is the best console release, even beating out the other ports. And it's just one of those things, you have to have a taste for ridiculous first-person shooters, and you have to have a taste for a little bit of jank as well, because even these platforms right here that scale up, sometimes getting on them can be absolutely a challenge. But this game was basically made by a couple of college students who decided, I think we can make a video game, so let's give it a shot. So honestly, for the amount of effort put in here, and for the tiny team making their first game, this thing absolutely, if you take that into context, is a blast for 3DO. Because that is the thing, the 3DO company really wanted developers, so they were letting a lot of small companies get access to development hardware, and you end up with some people getting their start in gaming on the 3DO, people like Naughty Dog with Way of the Warrior before Crash Bandicoot. Now let's move over to Lucienne's quest and the first FMV sequence of this actual testing video. The reality is I haven't found an FMV yet that skips or otherwise crashes the core, which is completely different than the Sega Saturn core from SRG 320, because at the start of that, for like the first 6 months, you would have to beat start like it owed you money if you actually wanted to get in-game. The only thing going on currently with the core, the two issues are: one, every once in a while you're going to get some clicking in the audio tracks, and two, every once in a while you're going to get a couple of horizontal pixels across the screen when it actually is outside of its RAM access zone. I explained that in a previous testing video, but basically with the VRAM, there are different offsets, at least at this point in time, that you have to set to make sure that goes away. But if it wasn't for those two issues, I would say this core basically feels done. SRG 320 let this one bake a long time in the oven, and it absolutely shows. And the nice thing is, even though there aren't very many RPGs on the 3DO whatsoever, the fact that you get Lucienne's Quest as one of the few is great, because this game, it's not going to live up to the Chrono Triggers of the world, but I would say it's absolutely an exceptional JRPG, and one that is definitely worth playing. It has a really nice mix of 2D and 3D elements where you can kind of scroll the camera around, and feels a little bit like a Grandia in that same aspect. And this one, absolutely, if you've never played it before and you want to test the core out, I can't recommend it enough. Just be aware that the core will save, but once you actually reset the core, that save disappears because it's not persistent right now. So if you want to beat this one, you're going to have to do it in one playdown session, where you're going to basically have to leave your MiSTer on overnight like you would an SNES or Genesis back in the day. Let's do the first of two soundtrack samples so you can hear what the music in Lucienne's Quest sounds like, but come back because I got 2 more 3DO games to test and show you. Now, Lucienne's Quest is one of those games where the actual audio issue doesn't really seem to crop up much whatsoever, but in the last game in this video, it's one that I pulled the entire audio track out from underneath the video and didn't do an audio soundtrack sample because the clicking was probably louder than the actual underlying music. And that's totally fine, that's how this works, but it's one of those things, if you're going to test the 3DO core, maybe start with your volume slightly low and then raise it up to make sure you don't hear that clipping too loud, especially if you're wearing headphones. But moving over to Casper, this is a game that I feel like doesn't really get talked about enough whatsoever. It's absolutely a really fun 2D isometric platform game. Well, technically a platformer, even though Casper doesn't really jump, and it really has a good kind of graphical appearance and some really nice transparencies as well, showing exactly what the 3DO could handle as far as actual visual effects are concerned. When the Sega Saturn had dithering, the 3DO had full transparency. As you can see here, everything is showing by Casper kind of going through him. Now, this game is definitely a vibe as well. It really is fun, it really is charming, and it has great voice acting for basically every character. You can tell the developers here put absolutely everything they could into making this game a super fun and engaging time, and definitely seems to be working exactly like it should on the 3DO core as it would on real hardware. But the reality of the situation is, I definitely have a 3DO with an optical disc emulator and a very large library of discs, but for the most part, no one's really going to be able to compare this thing against real 3DO hardware, because I'm assuming 99 out of 100 people watching this video don't even own a 3DO. So if you do, leave me a comment down below and you tell me if you have one, and you tell me if you had one back in its actual retail heyday, because I remember getting one, absolutely stoked for it, and had a ton of fun. But honestly, Casper is a vibe. It's not going to be for everyone, but it has an absolutely beautiful 2D aesthetic with some really fun visual effects that show that the 3DO had a ton of power. And it's just one of those things, the 3DO never really sold that well, so a lot of people missed this game back in the day. It's also going to be our second soundtrack sample. The audio is like 98% of the way there, and don't worry, nothing that's going to bother your ears whatsoever, but go ahead and listen, and I'll be right back with one more game to show you that works on the current 3DO core.
That's my room, but Kat and her father are in there. I need to find them both a present first, or else I'll scare them away.
I mean, every once in a while there might be a light crackle there, but for the most part it just sounds like Casper. Now moving over to obviously one of my favorite games of all time and one of my favorite 3DO games of all time. This is D, and I am playing the English language release, not D's Diner Director's Cut, the Japanese exclusive extended edition, just because I felt like this is the one that most people are going to play because obviously it is in English. And even though there really isn't much text whatsoever in D, and in the Diner's Cut, you actually still get English up front. The voice acting is in Japanese, so you lose a little bit of the story. Now this is one that you can absolutely sit down and play through start to finish in one session, because it takes about maybe an hour and a half to 2 hours to beat D from start to finish. The unfortunate part is this is one of the games that does have that audio clicking, and it gets loud enough where I would say probably a mute if you want to play it right now. And that isn't a knock on the core. SRG320 has done an amazing job, but it is just one of those things. While any core is in active development, you're always going to have certain issues, but I would say on the playability compatibility side of the 3DO core, still I have yet to actually load up any sort of game that refused to boot or otherwise what I would consider unplayable. And that really is, for a first draft of a core, something we don't usually see on MiSTer FPGA. It just seems like SRG320 decided to change up his own development process when he made this, because on the Sega Saturn core, the first core that ever came out, I think it maybe played like 1 or 2 games with absolutely no good audio and graphics that were completely missing. So it's kind of fun to see the opposite end of the spectrum where a core comes out and it basically feels like it's at the finish line, just waiting for some finishing touches before it would be considered done. And before you ask, there is no news as of me doing this voiceover as to whether or not this is going to come to a single RAM core. I'm sure if it's possible, SRG320 will absolutely do it, but we're just going to have to wait and hear more on that. And if for some reason that changes between the time I do this voiceover and I actually release this video, because I do make them in advance, I will leave a note in the description telling you whether or not single RAM is coming. but if you want to play D on the 3DO core today, you can totally do it. I might just recommend you turn your volume down low and I can hear the volume of the clicks and then bring it up to an acceptable level if you decide to actually play the game that way. But of all the games that have issues, as far as the audio is concerned, which I would probably say is about a quarter of the games I have tested, for some reason D's audio levels are just higher than everything else, and the actual clicking in the background track is louder than a lot of the other games that exhibit the same issue. But as far as the FMV playback, as far as the access speed, everything here feels exactly like it should when you're playing D. And for some strange reason you've never played this game before, it is an absolute vibe. It is one of my favorite games of all time in the horror genre, and I can't recommend that enough. It's completely janky in all the best ways, and leads into D2 on the Dreamcast, and if you know me and the channel, the unfortunately cancelled 3DO M2 version of D2, which I am still hunting for to this day. But definitely go ahead and give the core a shot. Basically, now you don't need to actually have the unstable main as far as the actual MiSTer operating system is concerned, but you do have to still have dual RAM. If you have been testing the core, leave me your thoughts and comments down below. I would be curious. But I'll see you guys next time. Bye-bye.